At the first breath of dawn, Rome awoke hungry. A thin mist clung to the great arches of the Colosseum, where the early light revealed streaks of dried blood like veins upon stone. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of rust and wine. Beneath the stands, vendors shouted for attention, their voices echoing through marble corridors, selling olives, bread and watered wine to men and women who came not to eat, but to witness death. Beyond the iron gates, chaos stirred. Starved lions paced in their cages, ribs pressing through fur, their growls rumbling like distant thunder. Elephants stamped and swayed in fury, their eyes rolling white with fear. Panthers slashed at the bars, their claws screeching against the metal. In the tunnels below, the clang of swords rang sharp and cold. Not training strikes, but final tests for the steel that would soon drink blood. The city gathered. From senators wrapped in white to slaves smeared in dust, tens of thousands poured into the arena's mouth. The sun climbed, and with it rose the roar of 50,000 voices, a sound that shook the ground and rolled through the city like a living storm. Here, inside this monument of power, Rome turned death into theater. This was not sport, it was religion. Every cheer was a prayer to the empire, every scream a hymn to control. The Colosseum was the heart of Rome's cruelty, its machinery of order greased by blood. The people came to see bodies break, not because they hated the victims, but because it reminded them who ruled the world. In the imperial box, a senator raised his cup as the emperor's banner unfurled in the wind. Below, the sand shimmered pale and perfect, soon to be stained red again. The gates creaked open, chains rattled, and the crowd fell silent. Somewhere deep beneath the stands, a trumpet blared. The show was beginning. In that moment, under the blazing Roman sun, the empire's greatest illusion came alive, that death could be beautiful, that violence could be glory. The crowd believed it. The emperors demanded it, and beneath the cheers, the earth itself seemed to tremble with the weight of what humanity had become. The Colosseum did not just host death. It rehearsed it, refined it, and fed it to the masses until mercy was forgotten. Rome's mourning began not with prayer, but with the promise of blood, and the people, obedient and eager, applauded the cruelty that kept them free. The roar of the Colosseum faded into memory, but Rome's appetite for death had ancient roots, roots buried deep in grief and ritual. Long before emperors ruled from marble thrones, before crowds chanted for blood beneath golden banners, death in Rome had been a sacred duty. It began, historians say, in 264 BC, in a cattle market heavy with the stench of dung and smoke. There the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever prepared to honor their father, not with incense or hymns, but with slaughter. 3 pairs of slaves were armed, stripped to the waist and forced to fight to the death. As their blood seeped into the ground, the gathered Romans whispered that the spirits were satisfied. It was not called entertainment. It was called munus, a gift owed to the dead. But in Rome, every ritual was destined to become spectacle. What began as grief became display. The elites, hungry to prove their piety and power, borrowed from older peoples, the Campanians, who sacrificed warriors at graves, and the Samnites, who made combat a sacred art. Soon noble funerals turned into orchestrated bloodletting. To bury a man with jewels showed wealth. To bury him with dying men proved dominion. The custom spread like fire through the Republic. The Senate, always alert to the heartbeat of the mob, saw potential. By the 3rd century BC, gladiatorial duels were no longer confined to funerals. They erupted at festivals, victory parades, even religious holidays. Priests called it devotion. Senators called it policy. The people called it a miracle. They could watch their gods fed with human agony. The armor, too, told a story. Each fighter dressed as Rome's conquered enemies. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade, the Gaul with his broad sword. When they bled, the crowd saw Rome's victories replayed in miniature. Slash by slash, death by death. Marcus Varro, the young legionary who once stood awestruck at the Colosseum gates, now watched these early contests from the ranks of the spectators. His eyes, once filled with wonder, saw the truth. This was not faith, it was control. The Senate used the dead to command the living. Each drop of blood whispered the same message. Rome ruled not only men and armies, but the meaning of life and death itself. What began as a single funeral offering had become a machine of obedience. a promise to the empire that even sorrow could be weaponized. And as the crowd cheered for the last man standing, Rome learned its most dangerous lesson, that death, once given purpose, could rule an empire. The roar of men had satisfied Rome for centuries, but soon human blood was not enough. The empire began to crave something greater, the submission of nature itself. From the deserts of Africa came lions and elephants. From the east, leopards and crocodiles. From the edge of the known world, giraffes. They arrived in chains, half-starved, their eyes wide with terror. What Rome called venationes, the great hunts, were not about survival but domination. It was Julius Caesar who first brought this madness into full light. In 46 BC, he paraded a giraffe through the streets of Rome, the first ever seen in Europe. The crowd gasped at its alien grace, its long neck reaching toward the sky. For a moment wonder filled the air, then Caesar gave the order. The animal was dragged into the arena and torn apart by lions before 50,000 witnesses. The message was unmistakable. If Rome could conquer the strangest beast of the earth, then no corner of the world could resist its reach. By the time of Emperor Titus, the slaughter had become industry. During the grand opening of the Colosseum, over 9,000 animals were butchered in a single festival. Lions, bears, leopards, wolves, and even elephants fell one after another under the blades of hunters and gladiators. Archaeologists would one day find their bones, etched with knife marks, showing deliberate starvation to weaken them before their deaths. These were not battles. They were executions rehearsed to perfection. Behind the spectacle, thousands labored to feed the hunger of the arena. Caravans dragged cages across deserts. Fleets sailed down the Nile. Handlers whipped beasts to keep them alive long enough to die on Roman sand. The empire's reach stretched from the jungles of Africa to the mountains of Asia, all to satisfy the thrill of a crowd. Marcus Varro, now an officer among the spectators, watched one such hunt. As a starving lion collapsed before the spear, he felt no triumph, only dread. The applause of the people echoed like thunder, and for the first time he saw what Rome had become, a civilization that mistook cruelty for power. The Colosseum was no longer just an arena. It had become an ecological graveyard, a monument to extinction masked as glory. Beneath the cheers, the sand whispered a prophecy. When the empire learned to kill wonder, it had already begun to destroy itself. The illusion of honor died the moment the gates opened. The crowd rose to its feet as the first gladiators stepped into the sun, but these were not the heroes of legend, no noble warriors standing tall for glory. Rome's theater of war was built on imbalance. Slaves, prisoners, and condemned men were thrown against seasoned killers who had survived a dozen matches before them. It was not combat. It was slaughter disguised as art. Some entered the arena already broken. Their helmets narrowed their sight until they fought half-blind. Their armor was mismatched or absurd, heavy plates on one shoulder, nothing on the other, forcing them to stumble for the amusement of 50,000 voices. Many carried wooden weapons painted with gold leaf, mock tools of death that shattered at the first strike. The crowd laughed as blood spattered the sand. Others were chosen for ridicule. Women, called gladiatrices, fought stripped of dignity, their faces hidden by masks that mocked the goddess Venus. Dwarfs clashed with beasts in staged parodies of war. The crowd roared not for courage but for humiliation. The games had become a mirror of the empire itself, power built on the suffering of the powerless. Marcus Varro stood among the guards at the edge of the arena. He had once believed these contests taught discipline, that blood proved honor. But as he watched a trembling boy forced to face a giant secutor, he felt only disgust. The boy's wooden sword snapped. The armored killer advanced, helmet gleaming like polished bone. When the blade struck, the crowd erupted, and Varro felt the sound pierce through his chest like a knife. Weapons themselves became symbols of irony. The retiarius, armed with only a fisherman's net and trident, was made to face the secutor, whose smooth, rounded helmet was crafted to deflect the net. It was not a test of skill, but of cruelty. The audience lived for the moment the net tangled or failed, for the sound of the trident splintering, for the brief gasp before the final blow. Rome had mastered suspense. It no longer needed fairness, only fear, and when the victors stood panting above the dead, the crowd's chant rose like prayer. Ave Roma! Marcus turned away, his jaw clenched. He finally understood. that the arena was not built for bravery. It was built to teach obedience, to remind every Roman that life and death were gifts granted only by the empire, and that mercy in Rome was the rarest spectacle of all. By midday, when the sun hung high and the sand had already drunk enough blood, Rome unveiled its darkest masterpiece, Damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation of men to beasts. It was the hour when entertainment became execution, and mercy was outlawed. The gates of the Colosseum groaned open, and from the shadowed tunnels came the condemned, criminals, slaves, deserters, rebels, all stripped of humanity and dressed for death. They were forced to reenact Rome's favorite myths, not as stories but as living sacrifices. A man chained to a rock played Orpheus, doomed to serenade lions that would devour him mid-song. Another, bound to a post, portrayed Prometheus screaming as vultures tore at his flesh. Others wore flaming tunics soaked in pitch, their bodies turned into Hercules reborn, dying as the crowd applauded the illusion of heroism. This was not theater. It was control disguised as morality. Every execution told a lesson. Arsonists burned, traitors thrown to lions, thieves torn apart by wolves. Each death was tailored to the crime, as if the gods themselves demanded precision. In truth, it was the empire speaking through fire and fang. Defy Rome and you will die beautifully. The crowd watched with a feverish devotion. Children leaned forward on their fathers' knees. Senators whispered to courtesans as bodies burned. To them this was order, the cleansing flame that kept chaos away. To Marcus Varro, standing at the edge of the arena, it was something far more terrifying. The screams no longer sounded human. They were ritual chants, prayers to cruelty itself. Under Emperor Trajan, the madness reached its height. After his victory in Dacia, he held games that lasted 103 days. Thousands of captives, soldiers, villagers, women and children, were slaughtered in patterns so methodical that even generals admired the precision. The Colosseum became a calendar of death, each sunrise promising fresh victims. Marcus watched as a group of chained men were forced into the sand, their faces painted like barbarians. Lions emerged from iron cages, their fur bristling, their ribs sharp from starvation. The beasts tore into the first victim, as the crowd erupted in ecstatic cheers. A senator beside Marcus whispered, "Justice," but Marcus knew better. There was no justice here, only theater. Rome no longer worshipped gods. It worshipped its own cruelty, dressed in the robes of civilization. And beneath the golden sun, as the sand turned red once more, Marcus realized the truth. Rome did not rule by law or faith. It ruled by spectacle and the applause of the damned. By the time the sands of the Colosseum had grown heavy with blood, Rome's imagination had already begun to outgrow its own cruelty. The empire demanded something grander, more spectacular, seas of death. The arena was no longer enough. Now Rome would summon oceans. It began with Julius Caesar. Near the banks of the Tiber, he ordered a massive basin dug deep into the earth, a man-made sea where water shimmered under torchlight. Into it he threw not actors but real men, prisoners of war, rebels, slaves condemned to die. Armed with dull blades and heavy shields, they were forced to fight on ships that groaned like coffins. Arrows filled the air, oars cracked, and fire spread across the water as men screamed and drowned. Caesar called it a naumachia, a naval battle for the gods. The gods never answered, but Rome applauded, and that applause demanded more. Augustus, determined to outshine his uncle's spectacle, built an even greater lake, fed by a custom aqueduct, a marvel of engineering devoted to death. 30 ships faced one another, each manned by hundreds of condemned souls. They fought until the lake ran red, until waves lapped at the shore with the sound of dying breath. Senators toasted from marble balconies as the setting sun burned crimson over the artificial sea. By Emperor Claudius's reign, Rome had gone mad. Entire lakes were drained and rebuilt for the sake of slaughter. Thousands were marched to the water's edge, trembling in chains and handed swords. When the emperor appeared, they shouted their salute, "Morituri te salutant." Those who are about to die salute you. The words rang across the water like a funeral bell. Claudius smiled. The horn sounded. The massacre began. Ships crashed, catapults fired, and the sky filled with smoke. Bodies floated, faces turned upward toward the indifferent heavens. The crowd cheered as the lake became a graveyard. Rome had conquered the land, and now sought to dominate the elements themselves. Even the Colosseum was transformed. Ingenious engineers flooded its floor with water through hidden channels, turning the arena into a temporary ocean. One day naval battles, the next lions and gladiators. The same sand that drank blood now shimmered with waves. Marcus Varro stood above the watery arena, the reflection of the flames dancing in his eyes. He had seen men burned, torn, and crushed, but to watch them drown beneath Roman cheers was something new. That night, he whispered to himself what others dared not say aloud. The empire no longer rules men, it rules nature, and even nature is dying. Rome's thirst for spectacle had always been cruel, but now the cruelty no longer served the empire. It served the emperors themselves. The arena, once a weapon of control, became their personal stage. Every scream, every drop of blood, was applause for power. Caligula was the first to turn madness into policy. When he ran out of prisoners and beasts to slaughter, he simply turned to the crowd. Random spectators were seized from the stands, dragged through the gates and thrown into the sand to die. He watched with a smile, delighted by the shock, calling it a lesson in loyalty. Marcus Varro stood among the guards that day, his stomach tightening as he realized the truth. No one in Rome was safe from becoming the next spectacle. Then came Nero, the artist emperor. He believed death could be art. Condemned men were dressed as tragic heroes from his own plays, forced to reenact their parts until they perished exactly as the script demanded. Flames, poison, wild beasts, all choreographed to his music. The emperor would sit with his golden lyre, humming softly as men screamed to the rhythm of his songs. Rome called it theater. Varro called it insanity, but none surpassed Commodus, the god of the arena. He entered the Colosseum himself, dressed as Hercules, club in hand, lion skin over his shoulders, golden crown gleaming under the torchlight. Yet his battles were lies. The animals he faced were crippled, the gladiators disarmed. Every fight was a performance, every cheer forced. To refuse applause was treason. The crowd shouted his name because silence meant death. Varro watched him slaughter a helpless man and raise his arms to the heavens, shouting, "Behold Rome's divine strength!" And the people, trembling, obeyed. Even the so-called good rulers were not innocent. Emperor Trajan celebrated his victories with 100 days of games, thousands of lives erased in honor of conquest. The arena had become an altar of vanity, where humanity itself was sacrificed. And in the end, the gods answered in kind. Caligula was struck down by his own guards, his body mutilated beyond recognition. Commodus strangled in his bath by those he once commanded. Each emperor undone by the madness they had nurtured. Marcus Varro, standing in the shadows of the Colosseum, knew what would come next. Rome had become addicted to its own blood. Its emperors had mistaken cruelty for power, and their empire was now ruled not by reason, but by insanity dressed in gold. Time, relentless as Rome's ambition, began to turn its own empire to dust. The cheers that once shook the Colosseum grew fainter, replaced by a silence heavier than death. The marble walls still gleamed in the sunlight, but the stench of decay lingered beneath the surface, moral, not physical. Some Romans finally began to see the rot beneath the gold. Philosophers warned what the emperors would not hear. Seneca, weary of cruelty, wrote that the games hardened the soul, that every cheer for blood made citizens colder, less human. He saw how violence spilled from the arena into daily life, how men who applauded slaughter began to practice it. Long before him, Cicero had called such spectacles unworthy of a republic, though even he admitted their terrible charm. The people no longer cared for the Senate or the law. They cared for entertainment. The amphitheater, once the empire's pride, became its altar of corruption. Early Christians saw it differently, not as entertainment but as trial by fire. In the same sand that drank the blood of gladiators, they met their faith with death. Dragged before lions and jeering crowds, they refused to bow, believing that their suffering would outlast the empire itself. And perhaps it did. Writers like Tertullian called the games seeds of cruelty, accusing Rome of worshipping death as sport. Each spectacle, he said, was another stone laid in the city's own tomb. By the 5th century, the empire's hunger for grandeur had devoured itself. Emperors bankrupted their coffers to outshine their predecessors, spending fortunes on festivals that only deepened their ruin. The crowds, once noble citizens, became a mob, trading virtue for pleasure, faith for distraction, Citizenship for bread and circuses. Marcus Varro, now an old man, walked once more through the Colosseum's corridors. The torches were gone. The marble cracked. Weeds sprouted where blood once ran. He listened to the wind moving through the arches, and in it he heard the faint echo of 50,000 voices crying for death. The empire that had ruled the world could no longer command itself. Rome's arenas were never built merely for blood. They were built to shape obedience, to turn cruelty into order, and to teach the masses to love submission. And as the centuries passed, that lesson became Rome's undoing. The Colosseum stands still, silent, hollow, eternal, a monument not to strength, but to blindness. For every empire that glorifies suffering, there comes a day when the applause fades, and the silence that follows becomes its own eulogy.